The night was frozen and unforgiving when the Alpha King of Ironhaven quietly slipped away from his own feast. Not to hunt, not to patrol, but to follow a single maid who had just disappeared into the dark beyond the fortress walls. He had noticed the way she curved her arm against her body, the deliberate concealment of someone protecting something they should not have. What he found at the end of that icy path was not theft, not defiance, but a dying child, a cracked boot, and a woman standing between a doorway and everything she had left in the world, offering back what she had taken, on open palms, without a single word of apology. He could have punished her. He could have turned away. But instead, he made a choice that would quietly unravel every political arrangement his court had spent 2 years building. Why did the most powerful man in the North kneel before a maid with nothing? Drop a comment below and let us know what you think he should have done. The herb bundle was still warm against her ribs. Mira could feel it through the rough wool of her apron. A tight knot of dried thyme and wormwood, wrapped in a strip of linen and pressed flat against her side where the fabric folded over. She kept one arm curved slightly inward as she walked, the way a bird curves a wing over something that needs protecting. Not from the cold, though the cold was everywhere tonight, pressing down from a sky the color of hammered iron, the kind of late autumn dark that arrived in the Norse highlands like an old debt, early, heavy, and permanent. The great hall of Ironhaven was behind her now. She could still hear it faintly. The low roar of men at their cups, the rough percussion of boots on stone, the hunting hounds shifting in their corner near the fire. The feast had gone on since sundown, and the kitchen had been chaos for 6 hours. Smoke-scorched air, shouting, copper pots large enough to bathe in, the head cook Sigrid moving through it all like a war chief. Nobody looked at Mira when she slipped out through the side passage. Nobody ever did. She was the girl who scrubbed the hearthstones before dawn, who carried water from the well in oak buckets until her shoulders had simply stopped registering the weight, who swept the rushes from the upper corridors every third morning without being asked, because if she waited to be asked, it didn't get done. Invisible was what she had learned to be, and invisible was what kept her safe in a place like this. She slipped through the low wooden door that opened onto the north side of the fortress yard and stepped directly into the night. Wind off the fjord moved through the tall pines at the valley's edge, a sound like breathing, like the land itself exhaling before sleep. The torches along Ironhaven's outer wall guttered in their iron holders, throwing ribbons of orange across the frozen mud of the yard. Mira pulled her cloak tighter, gray-brown wool, fraying at the hem, thin enough that the wind found the gaps with practiced ease. She had meant to mend it before the first hard frost. She had not mended it. There had been other things. There were always other things. She crossed the yard quickly, past the longhouse where the stable boys slept, past the woodpile stacked in a sagging wall against the stone, past the gate in the outer fence that the night guards left unlatched for the servants who worked the late hours. Past it and down the hill. The village of Thornwick lay below the fortress like something that had grown in its shadow without permission. A scattered arrangement of timber longhouses, turf rooftops, and narrow paths between them. Most of the homes were dark now, shutters drawn, fires banked low. She took the path down the hill carefully. Ice had glazed over the packed earth where the afternoon's mud had frozen, and the torchlight from above didn't reach far enough to be useful. She kept one hand on the wooden post that bordered the upper path. The other hand, as always, stayed pressed flat against her side, against the herb bundle. She had not taken it from the kitchen stores to use herself. She hadn't eaten today, nor much yesterday. But that particular fact had stopped registering as urgent somewhere around the age of 17. When urgency had been redefined by what happened to her brother every winter without fail. She was almost to the bottom of the path when she heard it. Footsteps. Not the sounds of someone navigating icy ground with caution. Not the stumble and recover of a man too deep in his ale, making his way home by memory. These footsteps were deliberate, measured. Heavy not with weight, but with something harder to name. The quality of a person who had never once in their life been required to move quietly. The sound of someone whose footsteps were simply the sound of where they decided to go. Mira did not turn around. She walked faster. Lena had not meant to follow her. He had been standing at the upper window of the great hall, the wide double arch that looked out over the yard, with the horn of mead in his hand that he hadn't touched. Below, the feast noise moved through the fortress like a living thing. His jarls arguing over disputed fishing rights, his war captain requesting additional men for the eastern ridge, his law speaker clearing his throat meaningfully every time someone raised their voice past the acceptable register. After 2 hours of it, Lena had simply drifted toward the window. Outside was easier to look at. He had watched the yard the way he watched anything he didn't need to, with the absent, half-focused gaze of a man resting his mind without quite sleeping it. He had seen her come through the side door, recognized her dimly, the slight woman who cleaned the east corridor every morning before he was dressed, who moved along the walls like a shadow with a purpose. He'd noticed her the way you notice a well-placed stone in a floor, present, familiar, part of the structure. But then he had watched her cross the yard, and he had seen the shape of her arm, the slight curve of it, the way she held her elbow too close to her body, the particular forward lean of someone carrying something they were trying not to appear to be carrying. He had grown up in a longhouse. He had ruled a territory for 11 years. He knew what concealment looked like. She had taken something from his stores. He set down the mead horn. He didn't call the guard. He didn't send his steward. He simply took his cloak from the bench where he'd left it after returning from the afternoon's ride, pulled it on, and walked out of the hall through the side passage. The cold outside was immediate and total, the kind that clears a man's head whether he wants it cleared or not. He rolled his shoulders once, breathed it in, and looked across the yard. She was already at the gate. He followed. The footsteps stopped. Mira was nearly to the first row of houses. She allowed herself one glance back, brief, angled, just enough to confirm what her instincts had already told her. The man standing at the bottom of the hill path was not a guard. He was tall, broad in the way that northern men of war were broad, not bulk for its own sake, but the accumulated density of someone who had trained their body into a tool. He wore a dark wool cloak fastened at the throat with a clasp she could see from 20 paces. His hair was black, wind-loosened, and his face in the torchlight from the path's entrance was— She registered this in spite of herself, with the helpless objectivity of someone noting an irrelevant fact. The kind of face that women in the longhouse whispered about when they thought no one was listening. Hard-lined, still. Eyes the color of iron-dark stone. Alpha King, Lena Thorvaldsen. She had seen him before, of course. Everyone in Ironhaven had seen him. But there was a considerable difference between watching him from across the great hall while sweeping stone and standing 20 paces from him on a frozen village path at night with stolen property pressed against your body. Mira turned forward again. Her legs wanted to run. Her mind reminded them what running meant. Running is an admission. Running confirms everything. Stand still and let the thing you're afraid of happen to you on your own terms. She kept walking. Stop! His voice was not raised. It carried the way cold carries. Not loud, but total, reaching everything it touched without effort. It moved through the night air and landed in her chest like a stone dropped into still water. Mira stopped. She stood with her back to him for a moment, one hand flat against the herb bundle, the other hanging loose at her side. The pines above the path moved in the wind. Somewhere deeper in the village, a dog barked twice and went quiet. Then she turned around. She met his eyes because there was nothing left to do that would serve her better. Lena looked at her. She was younger than he'd expected, middle 20s perhaps, with a face that might have been softer in different circumstances, but was currently arranged into something very precise. Not blankness, something more deliberate than that. The expression of a person who had decided that composure was the one resource she could not afford to spend. Her hair was dark, pinned back, several strands loose from the wind against her jaw. Her cloak was doing essentially nothing against the temperature. Her boots, he noticed this without deciding to, had a crack along the left side that had been stitched and restitched until the thread had simply given up. Your side, he said. She didn't move for a moment. Then, with the kind of steadiness that he recognized immediately as controlled fear, not the absence of it, but the decision to keep moving through it. She reached under her cloak and drew out the herb bundle. She held it toward him on open palms. That was all. No plea, no explanation, no tears. Just the bundle of herbs offered back with her chin level and her dark eyes holding his without flinching. Lena looked at the bundle, then at her. "Why?" he said. Something crossed her face. Fast, gone almost before it arrived. "I needed it," she said. The words had the shape of truth, but not the weight of it. He'd spent 11 years listening to men who were paid to tell him what he wanted to hear, and he'd developed a precise sense for when language was being used as armor rather than communication. This woman was not a skilled liar, but she was a committed one. Her eyes stayed too steady. Her jaw was slightly too set. "Did you?" he said, not a question. She didn't answer. The herb bundle remained in her outstretched hands, and the cold moved between them like a third presence. Lena looked at her hands, reddened at the knuckles. The skin at her wrists rough and chapped where her sleeves didn't reach. The hands of someone who worked every day without exception. He looked at the stitched boot, at the cloak that was more intent than insulation, at the herbs, wormwood and thyme he registered. A healer's combination, the kind used for fever. He looked at the bundle for a long moment. Then he did something that made no sense by any logic he could have articulated. "Keep it," he said. Her hands didn't move. Her expression cracked, just at the edges, into something that looked almost like confusion, as if she'd prepared herself for every response except this one. "Walk home," he added, "and don't let me find you in my stores again." He turned and started back up the hill. He had gone perhaps 12 paces when something made him slow. Not a sound. The absence of one. He had not heard her footsteps resume, which meant she was still standing exactly where he'd left her. And then, carried down on the wind from the village below, the sound that stopped him entirely. A cough. Small. Wet. Persistent. The cough of a child, coming from the house at the end of the nearest row, the one with the dark roof, no smoke rising, a shutter hanging by a single leather hinge. Lena stood very still on the icy path. He thought about wormwood and thyme. He thought about the shape of her arm against her side. He turned around slowly. She was gone, but the house at the end of the row was not. He followed. The door had no lock that functioned. Lena stood before it and catalogued this the way he catalogued everything, quickly and without sentiment. Rusted iron latch, bent from the frame. Wood swollen at the base from moisture. A strip of old rope stuffed into the gap along the side where the wind came through anyway. He could hear voices inside. Low voices, the kind used when something fragile was nearby. And beneath them, the fire. A weak, struggling sound, the thin pop of wood that hadn't fully caught. He raised his fist and knocked. Silence. Then the specific silence of people who had learned to go very still when knocking came at night. "I haven't come to take anything," he said through the door. "I followed you from the path." A long pause. Then her voice from just the other side of the wood. "I know." "Let me in." Another pause. Then, "Why?" He considered the question honestly. He had asked it of himself on the walk down. The answer was still forming, the way answers did when they were true rather than constructed. "Because I heard the cough," he said. He heard her exhale, a short, compressed sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a curse. Then the scrape of something being moved. The door opened. Inside, one room. He took it in the way he took in everything, fully, without filtering. A low sleeping shelf built into the far wall. A stone hearth where a fire was indeed barely alive. 3 pieces of damp birchwood leaning over a handful of orange coals like men propping each other up. A rough table, 2 stools, a shelf with almost nothing on it. A clay bowl, a small knife, a stub of tallow candle. And on the sleeping shelf, under a mound of layered cloth, a man's old cloak. What appeared to be a canvas sack repurposed as a blanket. A child. A boy, perhaps 6 years old, with the same dark eyes as his sister and a fever that had deepened the hollows beneath them and put an unnatural heat into his cheeks. He was watching Lena from the sleeping shelf with the particular, animal stillness of a child who had already learned, too early, that strangers in doorways generally arrived with demands. His chest rose and fell with visible effort. Every few breaths the cough came. Wet, too large for the small body it came from. Lena stood in the doorway. Mira stood between him and the child, not with her arms spread, not dramatically, just present, her body positioned in the space between door and sleeping shelf with a precision that was entirely deliberate. Her chin was up. Her hands were at her sides, fingers curled. Everything about her posture said, "Here is where you stop." "His name is Soren," she said. "He is my brother. The fever has been 5 days." Her voice was level. The facts delivered without ornament, without any invitation for pity. Just the shape of the situation, offered plainly. "I have given him everything I know to give." She paused. "Ironhaven's healer lives at the north end of the village. I went to him 3 days ago." Another pause, this one shorter. "He told me he doesn't treat servants' families without payment in advance." The fire popped. Soren coughed. "The herbs," Lena said, "were for him. Wormwood for the fever, thyme for the chest." Her eyes stayed on him. "He hasn't kept much down. I thought the steam from a poultice might help." Lena looked at the boy on the shelf. Soren had not looked away from him once. There was no welcome in those dark eyes. No fear either. Just a watchfulness that was far too old for the face wearing it. Something moved in Lena's chest. He turned back to the door. "I'll send Rune tonight." Mira's composure shifted, not into relief, into something more complicated. A tightening around her eyes, a small parting of her lips, as if the words had landed somewhere she hadn't expected them to reach. "He won't come," she said. "Not for—" "He will come." Lena's voice had dropped into something quiet and absolute, the register that had nothing to do with volume. "When I send him." A silence. "Why?" she asked. It was the same question he'd asked her on the path. He recognized it and almost said the same answer. "I don't know yet." Instead, he said, "Because a child needs a healer, and because Rune apparently needs reminding of what his purpose is." He glanced once more at Soren, who was still watching him with those careful eyes. "Stay with your brother," he said. "Someone will come before the hour is out." He stepped back into the cold. The night wrapped around him immediately. Mira stood in the open doorway and watched him go. She stood there until the darkness swallowed the dark shape of him, until the only evidence that he'd been there was the sound of his boots on frozen ground, and then even that faded. Soren coughed behind her. She closed the door and went back to kneel beside the sleeping shelf. She pressed her palm to her brother's forehead, still burning, dipped the cloth into the clay bowl, wrung it out, laid it across his brow. "Who was that man?" Soren asked. His voice was hoarse and thin. "Someone from the keep." "Is he going to hurt us?" She smoothed his hair back. "No." A pause. "You don't sound sure." "I'm not entirely," she admitted. "But I think not." She pulled the old cloak tighter over his small shoulders. "Sleep." Soren closed his eyes. She sat on the cold earth floor beside the shelf, her back against the timber wall, and listened to the fire struggle and to the wind outside the shutter. She thought about the herb bundle in her hands on the frozen path, about the moment she turned and seen him and felt her heart perform something entirely outside her control, about the way he'd looked at the bundle for a long, still moment, and then told her to keep it. She had been prepared for punishment. She had not been prepared for that. "He will come when I send him." Not if, when. She sat with that word in the dark and waited. The healer arrived within the hour. His name was Rune, A narrow man of 50 with quick hands and an expression that suggested he had recently been interrupted at something he considered more important. He examined Soren with thorough efficiency, administered a bitter tea that smelled of pine resin and something Mira didn't recognize, left a packet of dried leaves with instructions for steam inhalation, and departed without once meeting her eyes. She did not need him to meet her eyes. She needed Soren's fever to break. That was all. Uphill, in the great hall of Ironhaven, Lena had returned to the feast. He sat at the head of the long table, with the mead horn he'd set down an hour ago, now refilled without his asking, and he listened to the argument about the fishing rights resume where it had left off. His face was its usual composition, attentive, measured, revealing nothing. But his window looked east, and once, between the argument's second and third iteration, he glanced toward it. Somewhere in the village below, a healer was doing the work he should have been doing 3 days ago. And somewhere in those dark timber houses, a woman was sitting on a cold floor, watching a fire, wearing a cloak that was barely adequate for the season. Lena picked up the mead horn, set it down again without drinking. A complication, said the part of his mind that managed territories and treaties and the practical governance of a northern pack. He told that part of his mind to keep its assessments to itself. The west wing of Ironhaven smelled like cedarwood and cold stone. Mira noticed it on her first morning in the new assignment. A week after the night on the frozen path, 5 days after Soren's fever had finally broken, 3 days after Lena's healer had arrived uninvited for the second time and left more medicine without explanation. She had been reassigned without being told why. Astrid, the fortress housekeeper, a broad woman with iron-gray braids and a manner like a ship that had decided to become a person, had delivered the news in the way she delivered all news, flatly, without elaboration, while consulting a ledger. "You're moving to the residential corridor, 4th floor, west wing. Lord Lena's private passage included. You'll start at the 5th bell. The east wing, where Mira had worked for 6 years, smelled like stone and damp and the specific cold of a space that was kept functional rather than lived in. The kitchen smelled like urgency and smoke. But the west corridor, the long stone passage with its heavy wool runners and the high windows that let in thin strips of pale morning light, smelled like somewhere a person actually lived, like a space that had been inhabited long enough to absorb the warmth of that inhabiting. She worked quietly. She always worked quietly. Swept the runners, wiped the stone windowsills, polished the iron sconces until the metal held the light. She had been there perhaps an hour, working her way toward the far end of the corridor, when the door at the end opened. Lena came out. Plain dark tunic, no cloak. His hair not yet ordered from sleep. Loose at the back, a few strands across his forehead, and he was already reading a document, eyes moving across it as he walked. Which was how he nearly stepped directly into the bucket of water she'd left in the corridor's center. He stopped, looked down at the bucket, then at her. His eyes were darker than she'd been able to register on the frozen path, a gray so deep it was almost black, the color of water just before a storm closes over it. She had not been this close to him in full light before. She forced her gaze back to neutral. "5th bell," she said before he could speak. As Astrid instructed. Something shifted in his expression, the barest reorganization of his features. "I forgot about the reassignment," he said, which was either entirely true or a very good approximation of it. "I can start from the other end," she offered, "if you prefer the corridor to yourself at this hour." "That won't be necessary." He stepped around the bucket, with an ease that her traitorous brain noted had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with how a body moved when it had spent its life entirely confident in its own space, and continued down the corridor, reading his document. He stopped at the window at the far end, stood in the pale morning light, holding the parchment in one hand. She returned to her work. For a while, there was only the sound of cloth on stone and the wind outside the glass and the occasional turn of a page. It should have been uncomfortable. It wasn't. That was the thing that quietly unsettled her. It had the quality of two people who had arrived, without discussing it, at the same unspoken agreement, that sharing a space did not require filling it. "You've worked in Ironhaven 6 years, he said, without looking up from the document. Yes. Before that? She ran the cloth along the windowsill. Outside, the village was still deep in the blue-gray of early morning. Before that, the river settlement at Valen. My parents died when I was 18. Soren was 2. She kept her voice even, factual, the way she had learned to speak about things that had once been enormous and had since had to be made portable. There was nothing left for us in Valen, so I came here. Alone, he said, with a 2-year-old. He was very portable at that age. A silence. Then, and she had not expected it from a man who appeared to be constructed primarily of authority and controlled stillness, a sound that was almost a laugh, brief, low, something that had slipped out before he decided to release it. She looked at him. He was looking at the document again, but the corner of his mouth had moved. Something in her chest did a thing she immediately instructed it to stop doing. That is not information you need, she told herself later, walking home through the cold. Men of power are occasionally human. That is not new. He showed you an unexpected mercy, and you allowed yourself to be warmed by it for a moment, which is the natural response of someone who has been cold for a long time. That is all. The warmth is not yours to keep. Soren was at the table when she arrived, a piece of charcoal in his hand, drawing on a flat piece of gray slate he'd found by the river. You're late, he said. I had additional duties. Is the keep bigger inside than it looks? Why? Because you keep coming home tired in a different way than before. He said this with the absolute composure of a 6-year-old who had learned to pay attention to things other people didn't notice. Mira sat down across from him. Draw your picture, she said. He held up the slate. On it was a rough but surprisingly careful sketch of Ironhaven, the main longhouse, the outer fence, the towers at each corner. Is that the Alpha King's hall? She asked. Yes, he pointed. And that's his window, the one that looks east. He watches the valley from it. I've seen him from the hill. He stands there sometimes. Mira looked at the slate for a long moment. Go to sleep, she said, which was not an answer to anything he'd asked. Soren, wisely, did not point this out. From the far end of the west corridor, half hidden in the shadow of the stairwell, a man had watched the exchange between the Alpha King and the Maid. His name was Harold. He was the fortress steward, lean, well-dressed, perhaps 50, with silver at his temples and a manner of such practiced pleasantness that most people forgot to look for what lay underneath it. He had managed the household affairs of Ironhaven through 2 regencies and 3 campaigns. He had survived every transition of power the North could produce by understanding one simple thing above all others: which way power moved and how to align yourself with it before it noticed you. He had been on his way to deliver a report when he'd seen Lena turn down the west corridor, not a route that was in his morning's shape, and followed out of the habit of noticing things that didn't fit their usual pattern. And now he stood watching the Alpha King of the Northern Pack hold a conversation with a maid about portable children. Harold was a man who catalogued unusual things the way a trader catalogues unusual coins, not because he knew their value yet, but because value had a way of arriving eventually to the things you'd had the foresight to hold on to. He watched the way Lena stood when he spoke to her, not the posture of a lord addressing household staff, something more level than that, more attentive. The particular attention of a man whose mind had arrived somewhere new and was still exploring it. He watched the maid, straight-backed, unafraid without performing fearlessness. Nothing in her manner that invited the conversation, but nothing that refused it either. Harold stood watching for another full minute. Then he stepped back into the stairwell and went up to the council chamber by a different route, his expression pleasant and unreadable. His mind was already moving 3 steps ahead. He had spent 2 years quietly constructing an arrangement he considered essential to Ironhaven's stability, a political alliance with the powerful Valdsen clan to the east, whose eldest daughter, Brunhild Valdsen, was unmarried, politically astute, and in possession of a coastal territory that would double Ironhaven's access to the northern sea routes. The discussions had been delicate and protracted. Harold had been their quiet architect. None of that architecture accommodated a maid from the East Corridor. That evening, Harold sent a letter. The response came in 4 days. Mira was in the yard the morning the Valtsen party arrived. A party of 8 riders with matching gray cloaks and the bearing of people who traveled with deliberate visibility. At their center, mounted on a pale horse, was a woman who could only be described as exactly what she was. Composed, beautiful, built for the attention of powerful rooms. Brynhild Valtsen. She dismounted with an ease that managed to suggest elegance and practicality in the same movement. She was perhaps 30, sharp features, pale hair braided back, wearing traveling clothes of deep blue that were both warm and impeccable. Her eyes, when they swept the yard, catalogued it with the precise efficiency of someone who had come to assess a situation. Those eyes landed briefly on Mira. "You work in the keep," Brynhild said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, my lady." Brynhild studied her for one additional moment, a clean, unsentimental gaze, then turned toward the great hall doors with the kind of forward motion that expected to be followed. Harold caught Mira's eye as he passed. His expression was its usual pleasantness. Just for 1 second, something colder moved beneath it. Mira stood in the yard with her bucket and understood, without needing it explained, that something had just shifted. She picked up the bucket and went to work. Brynhild Valtsen moved through Ironhaven as though the keep existed as context for her presence. Mira observed this from her usual vantage. The corridor, the doorway, the invisible edges that 6 years had perfected into a skill. Brynhild was efficient and gracious and spoke to the household staff in the clipped, benevolent tones of someone who considered courtesy to servants a mark of her own good character rather than theirs. She wore different clothes for morning and evening. She asked informed questions about the northern trade routes and listened to the answers with the focused attention of someone doing political work. She was, in every observable way, exactly what an Alpha King's consort was supposed to look like. Harold accompanied her at nearly every public moment. This told Mira everything she needed to know about whose idea the visit had been. Lena was civil, attentive in the way duty required. He sat across from Brynhild at the evening meal and answered her questions and listened to her assessments of the eastern sea routes with the patient focus of a man doing the work he'd been born to do. On the 3rd morning of Brynhild's visit, Mira arrived at the west corridor at the 5th bell to find it already occupied. Lena was at the far window, not with a document this time, but simply standing, looking out at the valley. The pale early light fell across his shoulder. He hadn't yet heard her. Or he had, and was choosing not to show it, which amounted to the same thing. She began her work at the near end, quietly, the way she always did. After a while, he said, without turning, "How is Soren?" She paused in her sweeping. "Better. Almost well." She hesitated. "He's been drawing the keep." "Has he?" "The towers mostly, and your window." She said it before she'd decided to. A brief silence. "This window?" "Yes." He turned then, looked at her with that direct, reading attention that she'd first felt on the frozen path, as if her face were a document he was trying to understand. "He watches the keep from the hill?" "He watches everything. He always has." She returned to sweeping. "He told me he's going to be a builder when he's grown." Something in the quality of Lena's silence changed. "He said that?" "He says it frequently, actually, with considerable conviction." Another silence. Then, "Ironhaven's North Tower has needed work for 12 years. The foundations are sound, but the upper structure needs rebuilding. It requires someone with good spatial instinct." A pause. "Your brother may have his uses." She stopped sweeping. She looked at him. He was looking at the window again, expression unreadable, but the corner of his mouth, that small betraying shift, was there again. Her heart did the thing she'd instructed it not to do, faster than she would have liked, and warmer, and entirely without her permission. "My lord," she said carefully, "I am a maid." "I'm aware," he said. "I mean," she stopped, restarted. "I'm not sure what you mean by—" "I know what you mean," he said quietly. "And I know what you're telling me." He turned from the window fully now, looked at her directly. I'm telling you that Soren's future does not need to be limited by your current circumstances. That is what I mean. Mira looked at him. The morning light was growing. In it, she could see what she hadn't allowed herself to look at too closely before. The exact set of his jaw, the weight in those iron dark eyes, the way he stood, as if he had never in his life been uncertain about occupying space. She thought, I am in considerable trouble. She said, That is kind of you. I'm not being kind, he said. I'm being accurate. She turned back to the sweeping. Her hands were entirely steady. She was very proud of her hands. Then, and this was the moment she would return to later, in the dark, when she was honest with herself about things. She did something she hadn't planned. She stumbled. Not dramatically. The wool runner had bunched at the edge, the way old runners do, and her boot caught it and she lurched sideways. Not a fall, just a sudden loss of grace, and she put out her hand to catch the wall and missed, and then there was a hand at her elbow. His hand, large and warm, closing around her forearm with a steadiness that stopped her tilting completely. She caught herself against the wall with her other hand and straightened. He was still holding her arm, not tightly, but the warmth of it went through the sleeve of her dress like something had been lit. She became acutely aware of how close he was, his height, the particular smell of him, cedar from the corridor, and something underneath it, warmer and darker. The sound of his breathing, which was entirely steady. Her own was not. I'm all right, she said. I know, he said. Neither of them moved for exactly 1 second longer than necessary. Then his hand released her arm. He stepped back, returned to the window as if nothing had occurred. Mira turned back to the swept corridor. Her elbow, where his hand had been, felt warm for a very long time afterward. It was Soren who broke the arrangement's careful equilibrium, though not by design. He arrived at the fortress on the 6th day of Brynhild Valdson's visit, which was 2 days after Mira had told him explicitly not to, and he did so with the cooperative expression he reliably used when he had already decided on the opposite course. She found him in the yard near the stables, looking up at the north tower with a piece of flat slate under his arm, his charcoal halfway used. She took him by the shoulder. You were told! I wanted to see the tower, he said, for the proportions. The drawing is inaccurate. Soren! He's behind you, Soren said. She turned. Lena was crossing the yard from the stables, returning from a morning ride. His cloak was dusted from the road. He saw them and stopped. His eyes moved from Mira to Soren. Something in his expression shifted. A small thing, almost invisible, like a stone at the edge of a frozen lake deciding to take its first drop of melt. A softening, brief and quickly controlled. Soren looked at him with the fearlessness of a child who has decided on instinct that someone is not a threat. You're the Alpha King. I am. You sent the healer. Lena glanced at Mira, who was presently occupied with the detailed internal catalog of every decision she had made in the past 3 weeks. Yes. Soren considered this with great seriousness. Then he held out the slate. I drew your keep, he said. You can have it if you want. The north tower isn't accurate yet, but the rest is good. Lena looked at the drawing. The careful lines, the towers rendered with a concentration that went beyond what most children brought to things. He crouched down, to Soren's level, which was not what Mira had expected, not at all, and took the slate with both hands, holding it the way you held a thing you intended to actually look at. This is well done, he said. I'm going to build things when I'm grown, Soren said. The north tower has bad proportions. I can see it from the hill. I think the upper section is too narrow for the base. Lena looked at him. A real look. The kind that took a person seriously. You may be right, he said. I've been told the same. Soren's face lit with the pure, uncomplicated joy of someone who has been taken seriously for the first time by someone who matters. From the upper window of the great hall, 2 figures watched this scene. Brynhild Valdson stood with her hands folded, her expression still polished to its usual pleasant surface, but her eyes had gone sharp in a way that was no longer decorative. Beside her, Harold said, "It is a small thing. It means nothing." Brunhild looked at him. "Nothing," she said, "does not require you to reassure me about it." The injury happened that afternoon. Mira was carrying a full water basin down the west corridor stone staircase, the narrow servant stair, steep and unlit, that the household staff used to avoid the main passage during the Alpha King's receiving hours, when her foot found the one step whose edge had been worn smooth by decades of use. She fell. Not all the way down. She caught the rope railing with one hand and took most of it on her other wrist and her shoulder, spinning sideways into the wall before she stopped. The basin went the rest of the way, a magnificent echoing crash from below. She stood on the step and breathed. Her wrist hurt, more than it should. She looked at it, already swelling just below the palm, tender when she flexed her fingers. Not broken. Probably not broken, but wrong. She made her way to the bottom of the stair, retrieved the basin and its scattered contents, and went to the kitchen to refill it. Sigrid looked at her wrist and made the face she made when she disapproved of situations she'd chosen not to intervene in. "You need that wrapped." "I'll wrap it later." "You'll wrap it now or you'll not carry anything for a week." "Then I'll carry nothing for a week," Mira said and picked up the refilled basin with her uninjured hand. She made it almost back to the west corridor before Lena came around the corner. He was not supposed to be in this part of the keep at this hour. His morning shape had council, then the gate inspection, then the vaults in consultation. He stopped when he saw her. His eyes went, in the manner of someone accustomed to assessing injury, directly to her wrist. "What happened?" "I slipped on the stair. It's not—" "Set that down." She set the basin down. He crossed the corridor in 3 strides and took her injured hand. Carefully, palm up, his thumb along the outer edge of her wrist below the swelling. His grip was precise, not gentle in the way of someone being cautious, but gentle in the way of someone who knew exactly how much pressure to apply and was choosing less. She felt the heat of his hands through the ache of the joint and had a complicated internal experience that lasted approximately 2 seconds. "Can you make a fist?" She made a fist. It hurt, but the fingers closed. "Not broken," he said, "but you should have it wrapped." He looked up at her, the look that read her face like a document. "You were going to ignore it." "I was going to address it after I finished the corridor." "You were going to ignore it until it was either better or worse, and either way, you'd had no choice but to address it." She had no answer for this because it was accurate. He was still holding her wrist. Both of them appeared to notice this at the same moment. He didn't release it immediately. 1 breath, 2. The warmth of his hands, the low ache of the joint, the 6 inches of air between them. Then, "Come with me." He led her to his study, a room she had cleaned but never entered while it was occupied, and instructed her to sit on the chair by the fire, which she did because refusing did not seem to be an available option. He retrieved linen strips from a carved box by the window, the kind kept for field use, and returned to kneel before her chair. She had a specific, vertiginous moment of reality rearranging itself. The Alpha King of the Northern Pack was kneeling on the floor of his own study to wrap her wrist. She did not speak. He worked with practiced efficiency. He had clearly done this before, in battle or training, pulling the linen smooth and firm, not too tight, anchoring it with a careful tuck at the palm's heel. His head was bent over her hand. The firelight moved across his hair. She looked at the window instead. "You should tell me when you're injured," he said without looking up. "Healer Rune has better uses for his time than a strained wrist." "That is not what I said." She looked down at him. He had tilted his head slightly to check the tension of the wrap, and for a moment she could see his face clearly, the set of his jaw, the line of concentration between his brows, the faint scar along his left cheekbone that she had noticed before without acknowledging that she'd noticed it. "You mean," she said carefully, "that I should come to you?" "Yes." His hand stilled on her wrist. He was looking at her now. the iron dark eyes close and direct. "That is what I mean." She was very aware of her pulse. She hoped, distantly, that he could not feel it through the linen. "My lord," she said, "I am a maid. I fall downstairs. This is simply the mathematics of my situation." "I'm telling you to change your mathematics." "That's not—" She stopped. "Not what?" he said quietly. She didn't finish the sentence. "Because the end of it was, not something I know how to do." And that felt too true to say out loud to someone who was currently holding her hand. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he completed the wrapping, tucked the end in cleanly, and sat back. "Rest it today," he said. "I have duties." "Rest it today," he repeated, and the quiet finality of it closed the subject. She sat in his chair by his fire with his linen wrapped around her wrist and listened to the crackle of the wood and felt, underneath all the things she kept carefully ordered and managed and contained, something loosen. Just slightly, just at one edge, the way ice sounds in spring before it goes. Harold moved through the consequences of what he'd set in motion with his usual elegant efficiency. The reassignment came 3 days later. Astrid delivered it the same way she delivered everything, flatly, while consulting a ledger. Mira was to return to the East Corridor effective the following morning. "An administrative adjustment," Astrid said, with the tone of someone repeating what they had been told to say. That evening, Mira collected empty pitchers from the corridor outside the Great Hall, where the Waltzen consultation dinner was in its 3rd hour. She could hear the voices through the closed doors, the council's measured tones, Brynhild's carrying laugh, Harold's smooth facilitations. She was on her way back to the kitchen when she heard 2 of the council members in the side passage. They were not making any particular effort to be quiet. "Waltzen Alliance secures the eastern coast routes entirely," one was saying. "Harold's been building toward this for 2 years. "The girl complicates it," said the other. "Which is why she's being removed tomorrow. Back to the East Wing. Clean." A pause. The sound of boots on stone receding. Mira stood in the passage with a pitcher in each hand. The girl complicates it. She had known this. She had known it from the moment Brynhild Waltzen had walked through the yard and assessed her with those precise eyes. She had known it and kept working and told herself it was simply the shape of her world, that she had always existed in the margins of other people's plans, and that was not a tragedy, it was a fact. But hearing herself described as a complication to be removed, not cruelly, just practically, the way you remove a block from a path so the path is clear, that was different from knowing. She set the pitchers on the floor. She stood in the dark passage alone. She felt the full, specific weight of being someone whose existence registered only as an inconvenience in other people's arrangements. Then she picked the pitchers up and went back to work, because that was what you did. That was what you had always done. That was what you would do tomorrow in the East Corridor, and the day after, and the day after that. Lena left the dinner early. He simply reached the point where the conversation had circled back on itself for the 3rd time and excused himself with the brevity of a man who required no further justification for his own movements in his own hall. He found Harold waiting outside the study door. Inside, Harold laid out the case with the efficiency of someone who had rehearsed it. The Waltzen Alliance, the council's recommendation, the coastal access, the strategic timing. He spoke without interruption for 4 minutes, and everything he said was logical and coherent and correct by every political measure that applied to governing a northern pack. Then he said, "There is also the matter of the residential reassignment. The maid, Mira, currently on the west level. I've arranged for her return to the East Corridor in the morning. Given Lady Brynhild's presence, it is simply more appropriate that—" "Why?" Lena said. Harold paused. "My lord? Why is it more appropriate?" A brief recalibration. Something moved, barely, behind Harold's pleasant eyes. "Propriety, my lord. With the Waltzen visit at this stage and the council's position—" "You've been managing this," Lena said, which was worse than loudly. "The letter to Waltzen, the timing of the visit, the reassignment. Did you delay Rune? The first time Mira went to him?" a silence that lasted exactly 1 beat too long. Rune makes his own decisions about. Rune does what he's told, Lena said, by whoever tells him most convincingly. He looked at Harold for a long moment. The firelight, the silence, the particular discomfort of a man who had not been genuinely seen in 11 years of careful positioning. Her brother nearly died, while you were building outcomes. I have served Ironhaven faithfully you have served your own influence faithfully. Those aren't the same thing. Lena moved to his desk, picked up the Voltson letter, set it down. You're relieved of the steward position, effective tonight. You'll be given provision for your years of service, and you'll leave Ironhaven in the morning. He looked at him once more. That is more consideration than you arranged for a woman with a sick child in a cracked boot. Harold opened his mouth, closed it. Something moved across his face, not quite remorse, not quite anger, something more complicated and less resolved. He inclined his head precisely once. Then he walked out and closed the door without a sound. Mira was in the passage outside the great hall, stacking the last of the empty pitchers when she heard her name. She turned. Lena was standing at the end of the corridor. He had come directly from somewhere. His expression held the specific clarity of a decision recently made, the kind that settled a man's face rather than unsettled it. He walked toward her. She stood still and waited, because she had learned that waiting was the most honest response to things she didn't yet understand. He stopped 3 paces from her. I know about the reassignment, he said. It's been canceled. She looked at him. You didn't have to do that, she said carefully. I know. Lady Brynhild is a political arrangement I was never actually consulted on, he said. That Harold built and assumed I would step into. I'm not stepping into it. The corridor was quiet. 2 wall torches burned in their brackets, throwing amber light across the stone. Somewhere further in the keep, the dinner was still in progress. Voices, a distant burst of laughter. My lord, she said, I am a maid. You are the person, he said, who walked down an icy hill in a cracked boot to bring her sick brother stolen medicine, and stood on a frozen path and held it out to me without one word of apology. He looked at her steadily. His eyes, in the torchlight, had shifted. Not quite to that gold she had heard the old stories about, the color that came with mate recognition, but something warmer at the edge of the gray. Something moving. That is not nothing, he said. That has not been nothing to me for weeks. She felt something give way in her chest. Not loudly. Not dramatically. The quiet structural shift of a wall that had been built over a long time and had finally decided it no longer needed to stand. Soren wants to rebuild your North Tower, she said, because she didn't yet know how to say the other things. I know, he said. I'm going to let him. The corner of his mouth moved. When he's older. She looked at him. He looked at her. The amber light. The old stone. 6 years of careful smallness sitting in her chest, waiting to see what she would do with what was being offered. She took a breath. The herbs were for him, she said. But I was hungry too. That was the truth that night. I was hungry. I just wasn't brave enough to say so. He looked at her with the same attention he'd given the drawing, clean and total. The way he looked at things he intended to understand. I know, he said quietly. You don't have to be hungry here. And the thing about those words, the specific, careful thing about them, was that they were not a king speaking to a servant. They were not a man managing a situation. They were a person speaking to another person across the 6 inches of cold air between them, saying, I see you. I have seen you. You are allowed to exist here. Mira looked at the amber light on the stone floor. She thought about the frozen path, about the herb bundle in her hands, about the feel of his hands on her wrist in the study, and the morning light in the west corridor, and the way he had crouched in the yard to take Soren's drawing at the level it was offered. She thought, I am not as hungry as I was. She looked up at him. His eyes, she thought. Looking at them now, in this light, with all the careful distance between them dissolved, had gone to gold. Spring arrived in the Norse Highlands the way it always did. Not announced, not ceremonious, just the slow insistence of warmth coming back to stone that had been cold for months. The North Tower was still standing, though Soren, who had grown 3 inches since winter with a confidence that appeared to grow proportionally, had produced 9 detailed drawings of what it could become, delivered at irregular intervals to Lena's study, each one more precise than the last. Lena reviewed every one. This Soren found correct and appropriate. Mira found it quietly extraordinary. Harold left Ironhaven on a gray morning in late winter, his year's provision in a modest cart. He didn't look back at the keep as he went. Whether that was pride or regret, no one could say. He settled eventually in a river town 3 territories east, where he managed a merchant's accounts and was by all reports scrupulously honest, as some men become when the particular currency they used to trade in is no longer available. Brunhild Valdsen returned to the east with the composed dignity of a woman who had understood the situation clearly before most others had. She was, as it turned out, not interested in being married to a man who was already somewhere else. She found within the year a match that was both strategically useful and personally engaging, which she considered a considerably superior arrangement. Rune the healer continued his practice. He did not require further instruction about who he served. He was not underneath his comfortable assumptions a bad man. He was a man who had needed the comfortable assumptions removed. He became, in time, a better healer for it. Astrid ran the household with exactly the same iron efficiency she had always brought to it, which everyone found correct and appropriate, and which Mira found, for the first time, not directed against her. Soren recovered fully. He grew, as children do, faster than anyone is prepared for. He became, in time, exactly what he had announced he would become. A builder, a designer, a young man with charcoal-stained hands and very strong opinions about load-bearing structures and the relationship between a building's foundation and the ambitions of its upper floors. The North Tower was eventually his, in the way that things belong to the people who love them most. And Mira, who had walked down an icy hill with stolen medicine and held it out on open palms with her chin level and her eyes steady, and who had spent 6 years being invisible in a place that had not deserved her. Mira remained. Not as a maid, though she kept the gray-brown cloak for years because she was practical, and the Highlands were cold, and a cloak that had survived this much deserved the dignity of being used. Not as a complication, not as something in a ledger, not as a margin note in other people's plans. She remained as herself, which was the thing she had protected through all the cold years with a ferocity so quiet it had looked, from the outside, like simply surviving. The self that carried children across impossible distances on nothing, that held out what it had, even when what it had was almost nothing, that stood in cold doorways without apology and spoke plainly and laughed 3 seconds after the joke, which was, it turned out, exactly the right amount of time, as it gave the joke a moment to prove itself first. Lena, who had spent 12 years being an Alpha King and had done it well, who had governed and fought and managed and held a territory together through seasons of ice and drought and the endless political mathematics of northern power, found that being known by a person who had no reason to pretend was a different thing entirely from being obeyed. Better, he thought. Harder, more real. The kind of thing that asks more of you precisely because it offered more. The keep on the hill above the village stopped being a thing the village looked up at with wariness. Soren's drawings changed over the years. The towers more detailed, the proportions more confident, the lines sure in a way that early drawings never are, and later ones can be. The house at the edge of the village stayed standing, its broken latch fixed at last, its chimney burning warm through every winter. It was not a story about a king's mercy, in the end. It was a story about a woman who had survived everything that tried to make her small, and a man who had been powerful long enough to understand that power was not the rarest or most valuable thing a person could offer. It was a story about stolen herbs on a cold night and what follows when one person chooses to follow the truth of a thing rather than the convenience of it. That is where it ends, not in ceremony, not in proclamation, but in the ordinary warmth of a keep that had finally learned to see everyone within its walls. All of them. Whole,